The Alpha Tyrant King held his sleeping Omega close. The Alpha say, "Wake him, and I'll kill you." The warning spread across the throne room in deadly silence. Several nobles froze mid-breath. A servant near the wall nearly dropped the silver tray in his hands. Even the guards standing beneath the black pillars avoided looking directly at the throne. Because there, against the chest of Supreme Alpha Kalen Morvain, slept a young male Omega. His head rested beneath the king's chin. One hand still loosely clutched the front of Kalen's dark coat, fingers curled like a child who had fallen asleep there accidentally and never been moved. His breathing came soft and even, utterly unaware that 37 people stood frozen in the chamber, terrified to exhale too loudly. The sight felt wrong. Kalen Morvain never allowed anyone near him. Not after the war. Not after the curse had twisted through his blood like poison vines strangling a tree from the inside. Especially not an Omega. Everyone within Blackthorn's citadel knew what happened during those nights. His feral curse became unstable. His pheromones flooded entire corridors. Thick, violent, predatory. Guards collapsed from pressure alone, their bodies simply giving up against the weight of an alpha whose instincts had turned against him. No healer could touch him without permission. No servant dared enter the royal wing after sunset. Yet this morning, an Omega servant from the lower wing, barely 19 years old, named barely a whisper among the kitchen staff, slept peacefully against the chest of the most dangerous alpha in the kingdom. Lord Cedric Ashford swallowed carefully before speaking. His throat worked visibly beneath his collar, sweat beading at his temple despite the winter chill pressing against the throne room windows. "Your Majesty, perhaps the boy should be removed before the southern delegates arrive." Kalen's silver eyes lifted slowly. The room immediately turned colder. "Did you not hear me the first time?" He asked it quietly. Not a shout. Not a growl. Just those 7 words, spoken in the same tone one might use to comment on the weather. Cedric went pale and lowered his head at once. His knees actually buckled slightly before he caught himself against the noble beside him. No one breathed. No one spoke again. The Omega shifted slightly in his sleep, a small movement, just a turn of his face toward the warmth of Kalen's chest. His fingers tightened weakly against the king's coat, as if searching for something even in unconsciousness. Instantly, Kalen's hand moved to steady him. Protective. Instinctive. Several nobles exchanged uneasy glances. That frightened them more than the threat. Because Kalen Morvain had never touched anyone gently. Not once in the 3 years since the curse had claimed him. The truth was, the entire citadel had been in chaos the night before. Kalen had returned from the northern border, half covered in blood after destroying a rogue alpha faction near the mountain pass. His coat had been shredded. His left side had been torn open by silver blades. By the time he reached the palace, his curse had already started flaring, dark veins crawling up his throat, pupils narrowing to predatory slits, pheromones thickening into something that made even betas feel like prey. The upper royal wing became impossible to enter. Guards stationed at the corridor entrance collapsed within minutes. The pressure from his pheromones spread through the halls like a storm front, heavy and electric and wrong. 2 beta guards lost consciousness outside his chamber doors. One Omega servant, foolish enough to have lingered too long, had to be carried out by 4 men, her body trembling uncontrollably for hours afterward. Every Omega servant had been evacuated from the entire upper level. No one could get close enough to treat his wounds. Until Ezra Vance walked into the room. Ezra was nobody important. At 18 years old, he had spent the last 2 years carrying linens and hot water through the lower halls of Blackthorn Citadel. His hands were calloused from scrubbing stone floors. His clothes were plain gray wool, patched at the elbows. Most nobles had never even noticed him before, and those who had looked through him like he was furniture. His scent was nothing special. Mild chamomile and clean linen, soft enough to disappear in crowded rooms. His suppressants worked reliably. His heats came like clockwork every 3 months and passed without incident in the small Omega quarters he shared with 3 other servants. He had no family, no connections, No future beyond these stone walls. That night, a frightened steward had shoved a basin of clean cloths into his hands and ordered him upstairs because no one else would go. "Just drop it inside the door," the steward had said, voice shaking. "Don't look at him. Don't speak. Just don't be there longer than you have to." Ezra had nodded, too tired to be properly afraid. He should have been terrified. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to drop the basin, to run back to his tiny cot in the lower wing and pretend he had never received the order. But Ezra had learned long ago that fear was a luxury poor Omegas couldn't afford. So he climbed the stairs. The moment he entered the royal chamber, he understood why everyone had refused. Kalen stood near the balcony doors, one hand braced against the stone archway, breathing unevenly. Blood ran down his side, dark, almost black in the moonlight, dripping onto the marble floor in slow, rhythmic splatters. His coat had been discarded somewhere. He wore only a torn black shirt beneath, the fabric soaked through and clinging to the wound beneath. But it wasn't the blood that made Ezra's knees weaken. It was the scent. Alpha pheromones crushed against his lungs like a physical weight. Not the controlled, civilized scent Kalen wore during court appearances, cedar and smoke and cold mountain air. This was feral, raw, predatory in a way that made something ancient and terrified uncurl in the base of Ezra's spine. "Run!" his Omega instinct screamed. "Run, run, run!" "Leave!" Kalen growled without turning around. The word hit Ezra like a wall. Not loud, barely above a whisper, but the command behind it was absolute. Supreme alpha pheromones laced the syllable, heavy enough to make Ezra's knees buckle. He almost obeyed. Almost. Then he saw the blood soaking through the king's bandages. They were wrong. Whoever had wrapped them had done so in panic. Too tight in some places, too loose in others, and the wound beneath was still bleeding freely. If it wasn't properly cleaned by morning, infection would set in. And with Kalen's curse already unstable. "You're injured," Ezra said quietly. Kalen finally looked at him. For one terrible second, Ezra thought he would die there. The king's eyes had gone almost wolf-like under the moonlight. His pupils had narrowed to thin vertical slits, ringed with silver that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His canines had lengthened, not fully shifted, but close enough to be visible when he bared his teeth. Dangerous. Cold. Unstable. The pheromones in the room thickened further, pressing against Ezra's lungs until spots danced at the edges of his vision. But Ezra still stepped closer. His hands shook while he reached for the clean cloths in his basin. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to drop everything and flee. But he had seen wounded alphas before. During the rogue attacks that sometimes reached the outer districts, when injured soldiers were brought into the healer's wing where Ezra occasionally assisted. He knew what happened when wounds went untreated. And something about the way Kalen stood there, bleeding alone in the dark, made Ezra's chest ache in a way he didn't understand. Kalen watched every movement carefully. The air grew heavier around them, charged with something that made Ezra's skin prickle. The king's hand tightened against the stone archway, cracking it slightly beneath his grip. Then suddenly, Kalen moved. Fast enough that Ezra didn't even see it coming. One moment he was several feet away. The next, the king's hand closed around his wrist, crushing, inescapable, the heat of his skin searing through Ezra's sleeve. Ezra gasped. The basin nearly slipped from his other hand. Kalen's silver eyes bored into his. The dark veins of the curse were visible now, crawling up the side of his neck like fractured glass beneath his skin. His breathing had gone shallow. His pheromones pulsed in waves, each one stronger than the last, pressing against Ezra until spots swam across his vision. "Why?" the king demanded. His voice had gone rougher, less human. "Why are you running?" Ezra looked directly at him. His entire body trembled. Fear flooded his senses, sharp and metallic on his tongue. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something he had never felt before. A strange, impossible pull toward this alpha who should have terrified him beyond reason. "Please," Ezra whispered. "Let me help." Something changed in Kalen's expression. Not completely. Not safely. But enough. The pressure in the room eased by a fraction. The king's grip on his wrist loosened, not releasing, but no longer crushing. His pheromones still swirled heavy and dangerous through the chamber, but the edge had softened, just slightly. Kalen stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he released Ezra's wrist. Fine. For the next hour, Ezra cleaned his wounds while expecting death every time he touched him. The wound along Kalen's ribs was worse than he had expected. Deep enough that Ezra could see muscle beneath, ragged at the edges where silver blades had torn rather than cut. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped. The bandages were soaked through. Ezra worked methodically, trying not to let his hands shake. He had done this before, not on a supreme alpha, not on someone whose pheromones made the very air feel thick as water, but the motions were the same. Clean the wound. Apply pressure. Bandage properly. Every time his fingers brushed against Kalen's skin, the king's breathing hitched. Not pain. Something else. The cursed veins along his neck would pulse once, then recede slightly. His pheromones would spike, then settle. It was like touching a live wire and somehow not getting electrocuted. "Why are you afraid of me?" Kalen asked at one point. His voice had gone quieter now, less commanding, almost curious. Ezra didn't look up from the wound. "I am afraid." "Then why are you still here?" "Because you're bleeding." Silence. Kalen said nothing more for the rest of the hour. But he also didn't move away, didn't growl, didn't threaten. And when Ezra finally finished and stepped back, hands bloody and trembling, the king simply looked at him with those impossible silver eyes and said nothing at all. By dawn, the violent aura shaking the upper tower had gone quiet for the first time in months. Ezra didn't remember falling asleep. One moment he had been sitting on the edge of the massive royal bed, exhausted beyond reason, watching Kalen's chest rise and fall as the king finally rested. The next, darkness had closed over him, soft and warm and safe in a way he hadn't felt since childhood. When awareness crept back, it came slowly. He was warm, unusually warm. There was something solid beneath his cheek, rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Something heavy draped over his back, and beneath it all, a scent that made his omega instincts purr with contentment. Cedar, smoke, cold mountain air, and beneath that, something darker. Something that smelled like home, though Ezra had never had one of those. He shifted slightly, pressing closer to the warmth without thinking. A low sound rumbled above him. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. Something between them that vibrated through his bones and made him sigh softly. Then, "Your Majesty, perhaps the boy should be removed before the southern delegates arrive." The voice cut through the haze like a blade. Ezra's eyes opened. He was lying against Kalen Morvain's chest. The Supreme Alpha's arm was wrapped around his waist, possessive and absolute, holding him in place like he belonged there. One of Ezra's hands still clutched the front of Kalen's dark coat. The same coat from last night, now wrinkled and blood-stained beneath his fingers. His legs were tangled with the king's beneath a heavy black blanket. And they were in the throne room. Ezra's heart stopped. He remembered now, faintly, distantly, being carried through the palace halls in the early morning. Kalen had refused to let him walk. Had simply lifted him against his chest like he weighed nothing and walked through the corridors while servants pressed themselves against walls and guards averted their eyes. Ezra had been too exhausted to protest. Now the entire court was staring at him. "Did you not hear me the first time?" Kalen's voice. Quiet. Deadly. Ezra felt the words more than heard them, felt the pressure behind them, the pheromones that sharpened with the king's displeasure. The air in the throne room seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone present. Lord Cedric Ashford went pale and lowered his head at once. "Apologies, Your Majesty." No one else spoke. Ezra should have moved. Should have scrambled off the king's lap, dropped to his knees, apologized profusely for the impropriety. He was an Omega servant. He had no business being anywhere near the throne, let alone sleeping on the king's chest in full view of the court. But Kalen's arm tightened around his waist when he tried to shift. "Don't," the king said. Just that one word. Quiet. Absolute. Ezra froze. Kalen's silver eyes met his. Something passed between them. Ezra couldn't name it, couldn't understand it, but it made heat rise to his cheeks and his heart stutter in his chest. Then the king looked away, toward the gathered court, and the moment shattered. The throne room doors opened again as royal healers entered carrying fresh bandages. They stopped instantly after seeing the Omega asleep against Kalen. One healer, a young beta with spectacles, whispered under his breath, "How is he still alive?" Kalen heard him. The king's gaze shifted toward the healer, and the young man immediately lowered his eyes, face draining of color. Before anyone else could speak, Ezra made a soft sound in his sleep. He hadn't even realized he was drifting off again, and tightened his grip weakly against Kalen's coat. Everything about the king changed at once. His attention snapped back to the Omega. The dangerous tension in the room sharpened immediately, pheromones spiking with something that made several nobles take involuntary steps backward. "Careful," Kalen said softly. That single word made the truth painfully obvious to everyone present. The Supreme Alpha was not protecting the throne. He was protecting the Omega sleeping against him. By the second day, everyone in Blackthorn's Citadel knew the Omega's name. Ezra Vance. Servants whispered it in kitchens. Guards muttered it during shift changes. Even the nobles lowered their voices when discussing him, as if saying his name too loudly might summon the Supreme Alpha himself. Because Kalen Morvain still had not sent him away. That frightened people more than the throne room incident. The Northern King had always been feared, but at least his cruelty followed rules people understood. He hated being touched. He avoided Omegas entirely. He trusted almost no one. Yet now an unknown Omega servant moved freely through the royal wing, while the king allowed it. No one knew what that meant. Ezra himself barely understood it either. He stood quietly near the long table inside the Western Strategy Chamber, while snow hammered against the high windows outside. Maps covered the dark oak surface beneath flickering candlelight. Several military commanders spoke in intense voices about border patrols and rogue alpha attacks. Ezra tried not to listen too closely. His attention kept drifting toward Kalen. The king stood near the far window, one hand braced against the stone wall. Even after several days, the wounds along his ribs still hadn't healed properly. Ezra could smell blood beneath the heavy scent of cedar, smoke, and cold alpha pheromones. Kalen looked exhausted. Not weak, never weak. Just tired in a way that made him seem dangerous for completely different reasons. "Your Majesty," one commander said carefully, "the eastern villages are requesting additional guards after the last attack." Kalen answered without turning around. "Send them." Another commander hesitated before speaking. "There are also rumors spreading through the lower districts." The room tensed immediately. Kalen finally looked over his shoulder. "What rumors?" The commander visibly swallowed. "That the Omega beside you is connected to the curse." Silence. Ezra lowered his eyes instantly, pretending to focus on the tea tray in his hands. He had already heard worse. Omega's servants stopped talking whenever he entered a room. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with fear. A few refused to stand too close to him entirely. Kalen's expression remained unreadable. "And the temple, becoming concerned, Your Majesty. High Priest Malker has requested audience twice already." Of course they were. High Priest Malker, tall, gaunt, draped in crimson robes lined with gold, had visited the royal wing twice already that week. Both times, Kalen had refused to let him inside. The king turned back toward the window. "Then let them be concerned." The discussion ended there. Nobody pushed further. Eventually, the commanders bowed and left the chamber. One by one, their footsteps faded down the corridor until only Ezra and Kalen remained inside the room. The silence felt different now. Not comfortable, exactly, but no longer terrifying. Ezra carefully crossed the chamber and placed the untouched tea near the maps. You should eat something, Your Majesty. Kalen's eyes moved toward him slowly. Are you giving orders now? The question should have sounded threatening. Instead, there was something quieter underneath it. Dry amusement, maybe. Ezra immediately lowered his head. No, Your Majesty. A long pause followed. Then Kalen spoke again. You keep trembling every time you speak to me. Ezra froze. He hadn't realized the king noticed. Kalen noticed everything. I'm trying not to, Ezra admitted softly. For some reason, that answer made Kalen stare at him longer. The pressure in the room shifted, not dangerous, just heavy. Enough to make Ezra suddenly aware of how close he stood to an alpha powerful enough to make entire room submit without speaking. Kalen's gaze drifted briefly toward Ezra's neck. Only for a second. Still, Ezra felt it immediately, the weight of that attention, the way it made his sense spike with something he couldn't control. His hand rose unconsciously to cover his scent gland, where his pulse pounded beneath his fingers. Kalen looked away first. Change the bandages, the king said quietly. Relief mixed strangely with nervousness inside Ezra's chest. Tasks were easier than silence. He moved carefully closer while Kalen sat in a heavy chair beside the table. The king loosened the dark coat around his shoulders, enough to expose the fresh bandages wrapped across his ribs. Ezra inhaled softly. The wound looked better than before, but not by much. You reopened it again, he murmured before thinking. Kalen's silver eyes lifted toward him. You always speak this freely? Ezra instantly regretted the comment. Sorry, but Kalen only leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. Continue. Ezra carefully removed the blood-stained bandages. His fingers still shook sometimes when touching the king, though less than before. That frightened him a little, because he was getting used to this. Used to Kalen's scent. Used to the dangerous calm that settled over the room whenever the king allowed him near. As Ezra cleaned the wound, Kalen's breathing slowly deepened. The violent edge in his pheromones weakened. Ezra noticed it immediately. So did Kalen. The king opened his eyes again. Their gazes met for one suspended second before Ezra looked down quickly. You're doing it again, Kalen said. Ezra blinked. Doing what? Calming me. The words landed heavily between them. Neither spoke afterward. Ezra's hand stilled on the bandages. His heart hammered against his ribs. Because he had felt it too. The way the pressure in the room eased when he was close. The way Kalen's curse seemed to settle whenever Ezra touched him. He had been telling himself it was coincidence. Imagination. Desperation. But Kalen had just confirmed it. Outside the chamber, footsteps suddenly approached fast. Then came a sharp knock against the doors. Your Majesty. Kalen's expression hardened instantly. Enter. A royal guard stepped inside and bowed quickly. High Priest Malker requests an audience. Kalen did not answer immediately. The air in the chamber cooled several degrees. Denied. The guard hesitated. He insists it concerns the Omega. Ezra stiffened automatically. Kalen noticed that too. Something dark flickered across his expression before disappearing again. Send him away. The guard bowed and hurried back out. Silence returned, but this time it felt tighter. Ezra carefully tied the final bandage in place. The temple really believes I'm dangerous, don't they? Kalen stood slowly from the chair. They fear what they do not control. That doesn't answer the question. For a moment, Kalen simply looked at him. Then the king stepped closer. Too close. Ezra's breath caught as the scent of cold cedar and dark alpha pheromones surrounded him completely. Kalen's presence pressed against him like a living thing, making his Omega instinct sing with a mixture of terror and something far more dangerous. You survived my curse, Kalen said quietly. That alone is enough to frighten this kingdom. Ezra tried to steady his breathing. Does it frighten you? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Immediately, silence filled the room. Kalen's eyes narrowed, not angry, more surprised that Ezra dared ask. Then slowly, The king reached up and brushed his fingers against Ezra's wrist. The same wrist he had grabbed that first night. The touch lasted barely a second. Still, heat rushed through Ezra's entire body instantly. His sense spiked, chamomile and linen blooming into something richer, something omega in a way he had never experienced before. Kalen seemed to feel it too. His hand withdrew at once. The atmosphere changed again, sharper, more dangerous. Neither spoke. Then suddenly, somewhere deep inside the royal wing, a loud crash echoed through the corridor. A servant screamed. Kalen moved instantly. The pressure from his pheromones exploded through the room, hard enough to make Ezra stumble backward. The king crossed the chamber in seconds and threw open the doors. Two terrified servants stood frozen outside near shattered glass, trays scattered across the floor. Between them, a young Omega servant struggled to breathe, panicked tears running down her face. Kalen's curse aura had spread through the corridor again. The Omega servant looked close to collapsing. Every guard nearby immediately stepped backward. All except Ezra. Without thinking, he walked past them and reached for Kalen's arm. "Your Majesty." The moment his fingers touched the king's sleeve, the hallway changed. The crushing pressure weakened instantly. Not gone, but controlled. The guards stared openly. The trembling Omega servant finally managed to inhale properly again. Kalen went perfectly still beneath Ezra's hand. Slowly, the king looked down at him. Their faces stood dangerously close now. Ezra realized too late what he had done and tried to step back immediately. Kalen caught his wrist before he could. Not rough, not painful, but firm enough to stop him. The entire corridor fell silent. Kalen's gaze lowered briefly toward Ezra's hand gripping his sleeve, then toward the frightened Omega servant still recovering nearby. Understanding spread across every face present at the same time. Ezra could calm the Supreme Alpha. The realization terrified the guards. Terrified Ezra even more. Kalen still had not let go of his wrist. At the far end of the corridor, another voice suddenly broke the silence. "Well," Malker said coldly, stepping from the shadows beneath the archway. "Now I understand why the temple is concerned." The high priest's eyes settled directly on Ezra. "This is no longer a rumor," he said quietly. "It is becoming a threat." The first sign something was wrong came 11 days later. Ezra woke suddenly in the darkness with heat crawling beneath his skin. At first, he thought the room was simply too warm. The fireplace beside the far wall still burned low, and heavy winter blankets covered him from the waist down. But within seconds, the discomfort sharpened into something deeper. His breathing grew uneven. His pulse sped up painfully, and the scent filling the room no longer smelled only like cedar, smoke, and cold stone. It smelled like alpha pheromones. Strong. Overwhelming. Wrong. Ezra pushed himself upright too quickly and nearly lost his balance as dizziness hit him. His suppressants, he had taken them. He always took them. Omega servants inside Blackthorn's Citadel were required to take suppressants regularly, specifically to avoid incidents near high-ranking alphas. But now his body felt feverish. Wrong in a way he had never experienced before. His heat wasn't supposed to come for another 6 weeks. A soft knock came from outside his chamber door. "Ezra." The sound of Kalen's voice made heat rush violently through his entire body. Ezra's stomach dropped. No, this was bad. He quickly grabbed the glass vial of suppressants from the bedside table. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Empty. His chest tightened instantly. He had been so distracted, so consumed by whatever was happening between him and the king, that he had forgotten to request a new vial. Another knock. Lower this time. More dangerous. Open the door. Ezra pressed both hands against his mouth and tried to steady his breathing. The scent outside the room had grown stronger already, heavy alpha pheromones rolling beneath the doorway like smoke, thick enough to make his Omega instincts whimper with need. Kalen knew. Of course he knew. Supreme Alphas could detect heat cycles almost immediately, especially unstable ones. Ezra. The king's voice sounded rougher now. Not angry. Controlled. Which somehow felt worse. Ezra forced himself toward the door before Kalen decided to break it down instead. The moment he opened it, cold fear shot through him. Kalen stood outside wearing only a loose black shirt beneath his coat. Silver eyes fixed entirely on Ezra, pupils blown wide, dark veins of the curse crawling up his throat in the flickering torchlight. His pheromones rolled off him in waves, cedar and smoke and something darker, something feral that made Ezra's knees buckle. The hallway behind the king was empty. Every guard and servant had already been removed from the royal wing. Kalen had cleared the entire corridor for him. "You're entering heat," the king said quietly. Ezra hated how weak his voice sounded when he answered. "The suppressants stopped working." "I didn't. I forgot to request more." "I'm sorry." Kalen's jaw tightened. The scent between them thickened immediately. Ezra suddenly understood the real problem. This wasn't only his heat. Kalen's rut instincts were reacting too. The curse made his alpha instincts unstable, unpredictable. If Kalen's rut triggered while Ezra was in heat, the realization made his pulse spike harder. "I can leave the royal wing," Ezra said quickly. "If I go downstairs." "No." The answer came instantly. Sharp. Absolute. Kalen stepped inside the room before Ezra could respond and shut the door behind him. The atmosphere changed immediately. The alpha pheromones surrounding Kalen pressed against Ezra's senses, hard enough to make his knees weaken. He grabbed the edge of the table beside him to steady himself. Kalen noticed. His eyes darkened. "Sit down." Ezra obeyed before realizing he had. That alone unsettled him. Kalen had never used that tone with him before. Not truly commanding, not with alpha pheromones layered beneath the words. Kalen remained standing several feet away, as though forcing distance between them physically. His hands stayed clenched at his sides. Every muscle in his body looked tight with restraint. "You shouldn't be near me right now," Kalen said quietly. "Then why did you come here?" Silence. The king's gaze shifted away, briefly toward the frost-covered windows, then back to Ezra again. "Because the moment your heat started, Kalen stopped speaking." His jaw flexed. The dark veins along his neck pulsed once, twice. Ezra swallowed hard. "What happened?" Kalen looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "I could smell you across the entire royal wing." The confession sent another wave of heat through Ezra's body. The room suddenly felt too small. Kalen moved farther back instead of closer. That hurt unexpectedly. "I'll have the healers prepare another chamber," the king said. "You'll remain isolated until the heat passes." Ezra nodded quickly, even though disappointment twisted strangely inside his chest. Why disappointment? This was safer. Necessary. Still, something about the distance between them suddenly felt unbearable. Kalen stepped toward the door, then stopped. A low sound escaped his throat. Not human. More wolf than man. Ezra looked up sharply. The king's breathing had changed. Slower. Heavier. His silver eyes remained locked on Ezra, now with dangerous intensity. The scent of alpha pheromones flooding the room thickened violently. Ezra's omega instincts reacted immediately. Heat surged through him, hard enough to make his hands tremble. Kalen noticed at once. Damn it. The curse inside him was reacting. The Supreme Alpha turned away immediately and braced one hand against the wall. The stone beneath his fingers cracked sharply. "Your Majesty, don't come closer." The warning sounded rough, painfully strained. Ezra froze. Kalen kept his head lowered, shoulders tense beneath the dim firelight. His control was slipping. Ezra could feel it in the violent pressure filling the room. But beneath the danger, something else terrified him more. Kalen was fighting himself for him. "You should lock me inside another chamber," Ezra whispered. Kalen laughed once under his breath. The sound held no humor. "You think walls would matter right now?" Ezra's breath caught. Slowly, Kalen lifted his head again. His pupils had narrowed completely, wolf-like, predatory. Yet despite that terrifying gaze, he still had not moved toward Ezra once. Not once. That realization hit harder than fear itself. Kalen crossed the room suddenly, toward the cabinet near the fireplace. He pulled out a dark glass bottle. Suppressant liquor, strong enough to dull Alpha Rut's symptoms temporarily. The king drank without hesitation. Then another. Still, the scent around him barely weakened. Ezra could see frustration building beneath his calm exterior. Why is this happening? Kalen's eyes met his. Because my instincts recognize you. The room went silent. Ezra stared at him. The king looked away first. As what? Ezra asked quietly. Kalen did not answer. That silence became answer enough. A dangerous warmth spread low in Ezra's chest. Despite the fear, he should have been terrified. Instead, his Omega instincts kept pulling him closer, toward the Alpha, trying desperately not to touch him. Kalen suddenly spoke again. Do you know what the worst part is? Ezra shook his head slowly. The king's expression tightened. I can hear your heartbeat. The confession shattered whatever distance remained between them. Emotionally, at least. Kalen looked exhausted now, not physically, emotionally. Like a man standing on the edge of losing control and hating himself for it. Ezra slowly stood from the bed. Immediately, Kalen's attention sharpened dangerously. I told you not to move. You also haven't stopped me once tonight. That silence again. Heavy. Charged. Kalen's jaw flexed visibly. Ezra took another careful step forward. Then another. The scent between them became unbearable now, thick with heat and restraint and something neither of them wanted to name yet. Finally, Kalen spoke through clenched control. Ezra. The way he said Ezra's name made his pulse stutter. Go back. But his voice no longer sounded like an order. It sounded like pleading. That changed everything. Ezra stopped directly in front of him. Close enough now to see how hard Kalen's hands trembled. The Supreme Alpha. The most feared man in the kingdom. Shaking because he was trying not to hurt an Omega. Ezra's chest tightened painfully. Without thinking further, he reached up and touched Kalen's wrist gently. The reaction was immediate. The violent pheromones choking the room steadied instantly. Kalen inhaled sharply. His eyes lowered toward their joined hands, like he couldn't believe what he was feeling. Ezra felt it too. The terrifying pressure inside the room softened. Not disappeared. Balanced. Kalen slowly lifted his free hand toward Ezra's face, then stopped halfway. That hesitation hurt more than if he had touched him. Your Majesty. Don't call me that right now. The words came low. Rough. Kalen stepped closer at last. One movement, enough to trap Ezra between the king's body and the edge of the table behind him. Still, Kalen never actually touched him. The restraint itself became unbearable. The king lowered his forehead against Ezra's slowly. Their breaths mixed. Ezra closed his eyes automatically. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Kalen turned his head slightly. His lips brushed dangerously close to Ezra's mouth. Almost a kiss. Almost. But he stopped himself again. A rough breath escaped him instead. If I cross this line tonight, Kalen whispered, I will never let you go. The confession sent heat crashing through Ezra harder than before. Not fear. Not anymore. Something worse. Kalen stepped back instantly after saying it, like the words themselves frightened him. But before he could create distance again, Ezra grabbed the front of his shirt. Weakly. Desperately. The movement froze both of them. Ezra's voice came barely above a whisper. Then stop pushing me away. For the first time since entering the room, Kalen looked completely undone. The mask cracked. Just for a second. Then slowly, carefully, the Supreme Alpha pulled Ezra into his arms. Not possessive. Not violent. Just desperate. And for the first time in years, Caleb Morvain finally slept without fighting the monster inside him. By morning, the entire royal wing knew something had changed. No one said it directly, of course. Nobody inside Blackthorn Citadel was foolish enough to openly discuss the Supreme Alpha's private affairs. Still, servants noticed things. Kalen stopped allowing other Omegas near his chambers completely. Ezra's scent lingered everywhere inside the western wing now. And most terrifying of all, the king had become calmer. Not softer. Never soft. Quieter. In a way that unsettled the court far more than rage ever had. Ezra noticed it too. 3 days had passed since the heat incident, yet Kalen barely left his side anymore. Meetings were moved into the Western Strategy Chamber. Meals arrived through guarded corridors. Even the royal healers were searched before entering the wing. It felt less like protection and more like isolation. As if the king was building invisible walls around him. Ezra stood near the tall windows of the strategy chamber, while snow drifted across the mountains outside. Behind him, Kalen sat at the long oak table, reviewing reports from the eastern border. At least pretending to. His attention kept drifting back toward Ezra every few minutes. The first few times, Ezra ignored it. By the 7th, he finally turned around. "Why do you keep staring at me?" Kalen didn't even look embarrassed. "You noticed." That doesn't answer the question. A long pause followed. Then the king closed the report in front of him. "You smell different after heat." The blunt honesty made warmth rush straight into Ezra's face. Kalen noticed that too. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his expression before he looked away again. Silence between them no longer felt awkward now. That frightened Ezra more than anything else. Because he was beginning to understand Kalen in dangerous ways. The king rarely spoke directly about emotions. But his actions revealed everything. The guards rotating outside Ezra's chambers had doubled overnight. The servants delivering meals were changed constantly, so nobody stayed near him too long. And every time another alpha came within arm's reach of Ezra, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kalen never commented on it. He didn't need to. A sharp knock interrupted the quiet. The moment Kalen's expression hardened, Ezra already knew who stood outside. "Enter," the king said coldly. High Priest Malker stepped into the chamber, wearing dark crimson robes lined with gold chains. Behind him followed royal healer Saren, an older beta woman carrying several ancient scrolls beneath one arm. Malker's eyes immediately moved toward Ezra. Disapproval darkened his face almost instantly. Kalen noticed. "Say what you came here to say." The priest folded his hands calmly. "Rumors are spreading beyond the capital now. The people are beginning to believe the Omega beside you is influencing your curse." Ezra lowered his gaze quietly. Kalen remained expressionless. "Fear becomes dangerous when left uncontrolled. The kingdom fears you already." Malker's voice sharpened. "That was before you started protecting an unknown Omega like a royal consort." The room went still. Even Saren looked uncomfortable after those words. Kalen's silver eyes sharpened immediately. "Careful, Malker." The priest did not back down this time. "Your Majesty, the temple has a responsibility to investigate abnormalities tied to the royal bloodline." Ezra finally spoke. "I didn't do anything." Malker turned toward him slowly. "That may be true." The answer somehow sounded worse. Kalen rose from his chair. The pressure in the room changed instantly. "I will not repeat myself again," the king said quietly. "Ezra stays here." Malker's expression tightened. "You are allowing instinct to cloud judgment." "No." Kalen's voice dropped lower. "I am preventing this kingdom from touching something it does not understand." Silence crashed through the chamber. Ezra looked toward Kalen slowly. Something about that sentence felt strange. Not just protective. Personal. Before Malker could respond again, Saren suddenly stepped forward. "That is enough." The old healer's voice cut through the tension unexpectedly. Both Kalen and the priest looked toward her. Saren carefully placed the ancient scrolls across the table. There are things His Majesty deserves to know before this escalates further. Malker's expression darkened instantly. Saren, you already know him, right? The room grew colder. Ezra's pulse started rising without understanding why. Saren slowly unrolled one of the faded documents across the oak table. Ancient symbols covered the brittle parchment, sketches of crescent marks and bloodline records. Then the healer looked directly at Ezra. Show me your wrist. Ezra froze. Kalen's eyes narrowed immediately. Why? Saren remained calm. Because I believe the answer to this kingdom's fear has been standing inside this chamber the entire time. The atmosphere tightened dangerously. Ezra hesitated. Then slowly he pulled back the sleeve around his right wrist. A faint silver scar curved against the inside of his skin. Small. Barely noticeable. He had always assumed it was a birthmark. But the moment Saren saw it, she exhaled heavily. Malker swore under his breath. Kalen went completely still. Ezra looked between them in confusion. What is this? Saren's expression looked grim now. 30 years ago, the royal family ordered the destruction of a bloodline known as the Lunar Omegas. Silence. Their pheromones possessed abnormal resonance abilities with feral alphas. They could calm instability, suppress violent instincts, even form unusually deep bonds. Ezra's stomach tightened slowly. No, Malker interrupted sharply. That bloodline was eradicated. Apparently not. Kalen had not spoken once. He stood near the edge of the table, staring directly at Ezra's wrist with unreadable intensity. Suddenly, dozens of moments began replaying inside Ezra's mind. The king calming when touched. The pheromones stabilizing. The way Kalen always reacted to his scent. The heat incident. The almost kiss. A terrible realization formed slowly inside his chest. You knew, Ezra whispered. Kalen's gaze finally lifted to his. Silence answered first. Ezra took a step backward unconsciously. You knew from the beginning. Not everything, Kalen said quietly. But enough. The hurt in Ezra's chest surprised him. He should have felt afraid. Instead, disappointment spread through him first. All this time, he had started believing their connection was personal. Now, suddenly it felt planned by fate instead. Useful. Necessary. Is that why you kept me here? Ezra asked softly. Because I calm your curse? Kalen immediately frowned. Ezra, was I ever anything more than that? The room fell silent. Even Malker looked uncomfortable now. Kalen stepped toward him slowly. That is not what this is. Then what is it? For the first time since Ezra met him, the Supreme Alpha hesitated openly. That hesitation hurt more than any answer could have. Kalen looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally cornered. His eyes lowered briefly before lifting back to Ezra again. When you touched me that first night, he said quietly, curse stopped tearing through my head. For the first time in years. The room remained completely silent. Kalen continued anyway. I tried to send you away afterward. Ezra's breath caught. I told myself it was instinct. A bloodline reaction. Something temporary. Kalen's jaw tightened faintly. Then I realized I was watching every doorway, waiting for you to return. Something inside Ezra softened painfully. Kalen stepped closer again. This time, Ezra did not move away. The monster inside me becomes quiet around you, Kalen admitted. But that is not the part that frightens me anymore. Their eyes locked. And suddenly Ezra understood. Kalen was not afraid of the curse. He was afraid of needing someone. The unrest reached the palace gates 3 days later. At first, it sounded distant, scattered shouting rising from the lower districts beneath Blackthorn's citadel. But by nightfall, the noise had grown loud enough to echo through the royal halls. Crowds had gathered near the temple square, carrying torches despite the heavy snowfall. Some demanded answers about the curse. Others shouted Ezra's name openly. By midnight, they were calling him a monster. Inside the Western Strategy Chamber, Silence pressed heavily against the walls. Kalen stood near the frost-covered windows overlooking the city below, while commanders argued around the long table. None of them sounded calm anymore. The temple refuses to disperse the crowds. The southern nobles are demanding an audience. If panic spreads farther east, trade routes will shut down before winter ends. Kalen said nothing. That silence frightened everyone more than shouting would have. Ezra remained near the far wall beside the fireplace, trying not to draw attention to himself. But every conversation eventually circled back toward him anyway. He could feel it, the fear, the suspicion, the growing belief that he did not belong inside the palace anymore. A sharp knock interrupted the chamber. One of the royal guards entered quickly and bowed. "Your Majesty, High Priest Malker requests immediate entry." Kalen's expression darkened instantly. "Denied." "Sire, he's already here." The doors opened before anyone else could react. Malker stepped into the chamber with several temple officials behind him. Snow clung to the edges of their robes, but the priest himself looked perfectly composed. Too composed. "The city is becoming unstable," Malker said calmly. "This cannot continue." Kalen finally turned toward him. "Then control your followers. They are frightened. They are listening to you." A dangerous silence followed. Malker's eyes shifted briefly toward Ezra. "The kingdom believes the lunar Omega has awakened your curse. The kingdom believes whatever fear tells it to believe." "And what do you believe, Your Majesty?" The room went still. Kalen's jaw tightened faintly. Ezra already knew the answer before the king spoke. "I believe none of you are touching him." The atmosphere changed instantly. Several nobles near the table visibly lowered their eyes. Malker stepped closer. "You are choosing one Omega over the stability of your entire kingdom." "No." Kalen's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I'm choosing not to sacrifice an innocent person because frightened men need something to blame." The priest's calm expression finally cracked slightly. "This is no longer about innocence. The people are demanding action." Kalen's pheromones surged sharply through the chamber. Every alpha in the room stiffened. "Then they can demand quietly." Silence crashed down again. Ezra looked toward Kalen slowly. The king had not hesitated once. Not once. And somehow that hurt more than the accusations outside, because every time Kalen defended him, the kingdom turned more violently against him in return. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Nobody wanted to remain in the room once Kalen's control started slipping. By the time the chamber emptied, only Ezra and Kalen remained beside the dying firelight. Neither spoke immediately. Snow continued falling heavily beyond the windows. Finally, Ezra broke the silence first. "You should let them send me away." Kalen's eyes lifted instantly. "No. They're tearing the city apart because of me. They were looking for fear long before you appeared. That doesn't change anything." Kalen crossed the room toward him slowly. "It changes everything." Ezra looked away first. That made Kalen's expression tighten faintly. "You think leaving would fix this?" the king asked quietly. "It would stop them from turning against you. You think I care more about public opinion than your safety?" "That's not what I meant." "Then explain it to me." The pressure in the room thickened sharply. "Not violent. Worse. Emotional." Ezra struggled to steady his breathing. "Ever since I came here, your curse has worsened. The nobles are turning against you. The temple wants your throne weakened." His voice lowered slightly. "I don't want to become the reason you lose everything." Kalen stared at him for several long seconds. Then he laughed once under his breath. The sound carried no humor at all. "You still don't understand." Before Ezra could answer, Kalen stepped closer and grabbed his wrist. Not gently. Desperately. "The reason I'm losing control," Kalen said quietly, "is because every person in this kingdom suddenly wants to take you away from me." Ezra's heartbeat stumbled painfully. The king realized what he had admitted the exact moment the words left his mouth. Silence filled the room. Kalen slowly released his wrist, but the confession remained, hanging heavily between them. That night, Ezra could not sleep. The palace corridors had become eerily quiet. Most servants avoided the western wing completely now. Guards lined every entrance. Torches burned outside the windows below, where crowds still gathered near the temple district. Ezra sat alone near the fireplace inside his chamber, staring at the flames while Kalen's words repeated endlessly inside his head. Take you away from me. Not protect the kingdom. Not stabilize the curse. You. A soft knock came at the door. Ezra immediately stood. Come in. One of the younger servants entered, carrying folded blankets. The boy looked nervous. They sent extra supplies for the storm, he explained quietly. Ezra nodded. Thank you. The servant hesitated before leaving, then finally whispered, Please be careful. Ezra frowned. What do you mean? The servant lowered his voice further. People are saying the temple plans to force the king's hand. Soon, cold dread settled inside Ezra's chest instantly. After the servant left, Ezra stood motionless for a long time. Then, finally, slowly, he made a decision. By dawn, Ezra Vance had disappeared from the royal wing. The first guard discovered it minutes after sunrise. The second Kalen heard the news, the entire palace changed. The western corridor exploded under alpha pheromones, violent enough to crack stone walls. Guards dropped to one knee instantly. Several servants collapsed entirely from the pressure. Find him. Kalen's voice no longer sounded human. Every search party in Blackthorn Citadel moved at once. The temple district, the lower city, the outer gates. Nothing. Hours passed. Then one scout returned, pale-faced, from the northern pass. There are tracks leading toward the mountain road. Kalen moved before the sentence even finished. Snowstorms tore violently across the cliffs outside Blackthorn as the king rode north alone. No Gus, no council, no control left. By the time Kalen finally found Ezra, night had already fallen across the mountains. Ezra stood beneath the abandoned shrine overlooking the frozen valley, half covered in snow. His thin servant's coat was soaked through. His lips had gone blue. But when he saw Kalen approaching through the storm, his face fell. You shouldn't have come. Kalen stopped several feet away. His breathing sounded rough beneath the wind. You left. Ezra looked away, painfully. I was trying to protect you. By disappearing. The kingdom was turning against you, because of me. No. Kalen stepped closer through the snow. The kingdom turned against you, because they feared what I would become for you. The words hit harder than the freezing wind. Ezra's throat tightened. Kalen, do not leave me again. The confession came low. Nothing like a king. Just a man standing at the edge of losing the only thing keeping him together. Ezra felt his chest ache painfully. Kalen stopped directly in front of him now, snow gathering across his dark coat, silver eyes searching Ezra's face desperately. I endured the curse, Kalen said quietly. I endured war. I endured becoming something this kingdom fears. His voice cracked slightly for the first time. But I cannot endure losing you. Silence. Then Ezra finally reached up and grabbed the front of Kalen's coat. The movement froze both of them. You idiot, Ezra whispered shakily. Kalen stared at him. And before fear could stop him, Ezra pulled the Supreme Alpha down and kissed him. For one stunned second, Kalen did not move at all. Then suddenly his hands were everywhere, one gripping Ezra's waist, the other against the back of his neck. Not violent, desperate. The storm howled around them while the kiss deepened, hard enough to steal breath from both of them. And for the first time since they met, Kalen stopped holding himself back. When they finally separated, Kalen rested his forehead against Ezra's shakily. Come home with me, he whispered. This time, Ezra did not run. And far below the mountain cliffs, the lights of Blackthorn Citadel burned through the snow like the beginning of war. By the time Kalen and Ezra returned to Blackthorn Citadel, the kingdom was already on the edge of collapse. Temple followers crowded the lower districts carrying silver banners through the snow-covered streets. Noble families had begun gathering private guards behind locked estates. Rumors spread faster than winter wind, some claiming the Supreme Alpha had lost his mind for an Omega, others whispering something far worse, that the king had finally chosen a mate. Inside the royal palace, nobody spoke when Kalen walked through the front gates with Ezra beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. That difference alone changed everything. The guards lowered their heads immediately. Servants stepped aside without breathing too loudly. Even the nobles waiting near the throne hall fell silent the second Kalen entered the corridor. The king did not slow once. His hand remained firmly around Ezra's wrist the entire walk through the palace. Possessive. Protective. Certain. The council had already gathered by the time they reached the throne room. High Priest Malker stood near the center of the chamber, surrounded by temple officials and northern nobles. The moment Ezra entered beside Kalen, unease spread visibly across the room. Not because of Ezra. Because of Kalen. The Supreme Alpha's pheromones had become dangerously unstable again. Dark silver veins spread faintly beneath the skin near his throat now, flickering like cracks beneath ice. Even standing still, the pressure rolling from him made several guards visibly tense. Malker saw it immediately. "Your Majesty," the priest began carefully, "the curse is worsening." Kalen's expression remained cold. "I'm aware. The kingdom cannot survive another feral outbreak. The kingdom will survive exactly what I allow it to survive." Murmurs spread through the nobles. Lord Cedric stepped forward next. "Your Majesty, this has gone too far. The people believe the Omega is tied directly to the curse." Kalen's gaze shifted toward him slowly. "Cedric." The noble hesitated. Just that single word, his name spoken quietly, carried enough threat to drain color from his face. Malker stepped in before the silence became fatal. "The council requests the Omega be placed under temple protection until the situation stabilizes." Temple protection. Everyone in the room knew what that truly meant. Isolation. Control. Possibly death. Kalen's hand tightened around Ezra's wrist instantly. "No." The answer came low and absolute. Malker's expression hardened slightly. "Then you leave this kingdom no choice." The atmosphere changed at once. Every guard inside the throne hall instinctively reached for their weapons. Kalen slowly stepped forward. The pressure from his pheromones exploded violently through the chamber. Several nobles collapsed to one knee immediately. One of the younger temple officials lost consciousness on the spot. Cracks spread beneath the black marble floor under Kalen's boots. Ezra's pulse jumped. The curse was getting worse. Kalen was losing control again. The king's silver eyes had begun shifting unnaturally, more wolf than human. "Listen carefully," Kalen said softly. "The next person who speaks about taking him from me will not leave this hall alive." No one moved. No one breathed. Then suddenly, Kalen staggered. The entire room froze. Dark veins spread rapidly beneath his skin as the curse surged violently through his body. A sharp growl tore from his throat, low and inhuman, enough to send fear crashing across the throne room. "Your Majesty." "Stay back." Kalen snarled, and the command shook the chamber walls. Guards retreated immediately. Even Malker stepped backward. Everyone except Ezra. The Omega moved toward Kalen without hesitation. Ezra don't. Too late. The moment Ezra touched Kalen's hand, the room changed. The violent pheromones tearing through the throne hall steadied instantly. Not gone. Balanced. A shocked silence spread through the chamber. Kalen's breathing slowed visibly beneath Ezra's touch. The black veins stopped spreading further up his throat. Every noble in the room stared openly. Now they were witnessing it themselves. The lunar Omega bloodline was real. Ezra looked up at Kalen slowly. The king stared back at him like the entire world had narrowed down to this one moment. Then quietly, Kalen whispered, "You should run." Ezra's chest tightened painfully. "Why?" "Because if I lose control completely," Kalen's voice lowered roughly, I don't know what I'll become. For the first time since meeting him, Ezra saw genuine fear inside the Supreme Alpha's eyes. Not fear of death. Fear of hurting him. That realization shattered the last of Ezra's hesitation. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer. I'm not afraid of you, Ezra whispered. Kalen closed his eyes briefly, like the words physically hurt him. The curse surged again. The throne room lights flickered violently. Several guards backed farther away in panic. Ezra realized then that this would never end unless one of them finally chose it completely. Not half-trust. Not restraint. Not fear. Choice. His fingers slowly rose toward Kalen's face. Then he spoke, clearly enough for the entire throne hall to hear. I choose you. Silence crashed through the chamber. Kalen's eyes opened immediately. Shock crossed his expression for the first time. Then something inside the Supreme Alpha finally broke. Not violently. Quietly. His hand rose slowly to Ezra's neck, trembling slightly, before stopping beside the Omega's scent gland. One final hesitation. Ezra answered it by leaning closer first. That was all Kalen needed. The mate bond snapped into place instantly. A pulse of silver pheromones surged through the throne room like a winter storm, then settled just as quickly into complete stillness. The curse vanished. Not entirely, but enough. The black veins beneath Kalen's skin faded slowly. His breathing steadied. The monstrous pressure suffocating the throne hall disappeared. For the first time in years, no one moved. No one spoke. Then one of the older guards lowered himself to one knee. Another followed. Then the nobles. Then the soldiers lining the walls. One by one, the entire throne room bowed, not to their king, but to the bond standing beside him. Kalen looked down at Ezra silently. All the rage, exhaustion, and loneliness that had haunted him since the beginning suddenly looked quieter now. Softer. Not weak. Peace. That night, Kalen carried Ezra to the royal chambers. Not because Ezra couldn't walk, though his legs were shaking badly enough that walking would have been difficult, but because Kalen needed to carry him. Needed to feel Ezra's weight against his chest. Needed to confirm with every sense that this was real, that the bond hadn't shattered the moment they left the throne room. The doors sealed behind them with a heavy thud. The fire had already been lit. Furs draped across the massive bed. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, painting silver patterns across the stone floor. Kalen set Ezra down gently beside the bed. Then he just stood there, staring at him, like he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. The bond thrummed between them, a new strange sensation, like a second heartbeat echoing beneath his skin. He could feel Kalen through it. The Alpha's exhaustion, his fear, his desperate, overwhelming need to protect. And beneath all of that, something warmer. Something that felt like home. Kalen, Ezra whispered. The king's eyes lifted to his. The dark veins of the curse had faded to faint shadows beneath his skin, barely visible in the firelight. His pupils were still slightly dilated, still more wolf than human, but the danger had softened into something else. Something hungry. I need to mark you, Kalen said. His voice came rough, strained, like the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. The bond isn't complete without it. Without? He stopped. His jaw flexed. Without everyone knowing you're mine. Heat rushed through Ezra's body. Not heat like his cycle, something deeper, more intentional. The bond made everything more intense. Kalen's scent. His presence. The way his pheromones curled around Ezra like smoke, promising things that made Ezra's Omega instincts purr with anticipation. Then do it, Ezra said quietly. Kalen's eyes darkened. You understand what this means. It wasn't a question. Ezra nodded slowly. I understand. A claiming bite was permanent. It would bind them together for life, not just emotionally, but biologically. Ezra's scent would change. His heat cycles would sync with Kalen's ruts. His body would become tuned to the Alpha in ways that couldn't be undone. If Kaelin died, the bond would tear through Ezra like a physical wound. If Ezra died, Kaelin would likely follow. But standing there in the firelight with Kaelin's silver eyes fixed on him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered, Ezra couldn't imagine wanting anything else. Kaelin stepped closer. His hand rose to Ezra's neck, fingers brushing lightly over the scent gland where the mark would go. Ezra shivered. The touch sent sparks racing down his spine, made his knees weak, made his Omega instinct sing with want. Last chance, Kaelin murmured. Ezra reached up and grabbed the front of his coat. I chose you, he said softly. In front of the entire throne room. In front of the temple. In front of everyone who wants to tear us apart. He pulled Kaelin closer. I'm not changing my mind. Kaelin made a sound, low, rough, almost wounded. His forehead pressed against Ezra's. His breathing came fast and uneven. Ezra, mark me. The growl that tore from Kaelin's throat wasn't human. His arms wrapped around Ezra's waist, lifting him effortlessly, and then Ezra's back hit the furs on the bed. Kaelin followed him down, weight pressing him into the mattress, warmth surrounding him on all sides. Pheromones flooded the space between them. Cedar and smoke and something darker, something that smelled like forever. Kaelin's mouth found his neck. Not gentle. Not rough either. Careful in a way that made Ezra's chest ache. The king's lips brushed over his scent gland once, twice, teasing, tasting, making Ezra squirm beneath him. You smell. Kaelin's voice vibrated against his skin. Incredible. Ezra's hands fisted in Kaelin's hair. Stop talking. A huff of laughter. Then Kaelin's teeth sank into his throat. Ezra gasped. Pain sharp and bright, lasting only a second. Then heat flooded through him, overwhelming, consuming. The bond blazed to life between them, silver fire racing along every nerve, every vein, every hidden corner of his soul. Kaelin's pheromones crashed over him like a wave. Ezra's body arched beneath the alpha's, responding instinctively, belonging in a way he had never experienced before. When Kaelin finally pulled back, his lips were red with Ezra's blood. The mark sat dark and permanent against Ezra's throat, a claiming bite that would scar silver, visible to everyone who looked at him. Mine, the bond seemed to whisper. Mine, mine, mine. Kaelin stared down at him with something like wonder in his silver eyes. Mine, he said aloud, voice rough. Ezra pulled him down into a kiss. And when they finally came together, when Kaelin's body joined with his, when the pleasure built and crested and shattered between them, Ezra felt the last remnants of the curse dissolve. Not gone forever. It would always be part of Kaelin, part of what he was. But quiet now. Leashed. Bound to an Omega who wasn't afraid to touch him. 3 weeks later, Ezra woke with his stomach turning inside out. He barely made it to the basin beside the bed before his breakfast came back up. His body heaved, trembling, until there was nothing left but bitter bile and the taste of sickness. Behind him, the bed shifted. Ezra. Kaelin's voice came rough with sleep, but the bond carried his alarm, sharp and immediate, cutting through the early morning darkness. I'm fine, Ezra rasped, even as another wave of nausea rolled through him. He wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for days. The nausea had started small, just a twinge in the mornings, easily ignored. But it had grown worse each day, spreading through his afternoons, then his evenings, until now he could barely keep down water. His heats had stopped too. That should have been the first sign. He was supposed to have entered heat a week ago, but nothing had happened. No fever. No cravings. Just this constant, relentless sickness. Kaelin's hand pressed against his back, warm and steady. You're burning up. I'm not. Ezra touched his own forehead. His skin felt clammy, but not feverish. It's just nausea. Probably something I ate. Kaelin's silence spoke louder than words. The king rose from the bed and crossed to the door. Ezra heard him speaking to the guards outside, low, urgent, commanding. Within minutes, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Healer Saren arrived before the sun had fully risen. The old beta woman took one look at Ezra, pale, trembling, still hunched over the basin, and her eyes narrowed. How long? About a week, Ezra admitted. Maybe longer. And your heat. Missed it. Saren's expression didn't change. But something flickered in her eyes, something that made Ezra's heart stutter in his chest. Lie down, she said. I need to examine you. Kalen stood against the wall, arms crossed, silver eyes tracking every movement. His pheromones had sharpened with anxiety, filling the room with the scent of cedar and storm clouds. Saren ignored him. She had dealt with possessive alphas before. Her hands pressed against Ezra's abdomen, gentle, methodical, searching. She checked his pulse, his temperature, his scent glands. She asked about his appetite, his sleep, his energy levels. Then she sat back and looked at him with something that might have been wonder. You're pregnant. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ezra's mind went blank. What? Your body is changing, Saren said calmly. The nausea, the missed heat, the sensitivity, it's all consistent with early pregnancy. The bond accelerated the process. Lunar Omega biology is different. More receptive to alpha seed. Kalen had gone completely still. Ezra looked at him, at the shock on his face, the disbelief, the way his hands had started trembling slightly at his sides. I'm pregnant. Ezra's voice came out high and thin. Saren nodded. Approximately 4 weeks. The bond likely triggered ovulation outside your normal cycle. She glanced at Kalen. Lunar Omegas were known for high fertility, especially with bonded mates. It's why the bloodline was so carefully controlled. Ezra's hand drifted to his stomach. It didn't feel any different. Still flat beneath his sleep shirt, still familiar. But something had changed. Something was growing inside him. Kalen's child. The king moved. One moment he was against the wall, the next he was kneeling beside the bed, hands hovering over Ezra's like he was afraid to touch. His silver eyes searched Ezra's face, desperate, hopeful, terrified. Is this? His voice broke. He swallowed and tried again. Do you want? Yes, Ezra said before Kalen could finish the question. Yes, I want this. I want. He couldn't finish either. Kalen pulled him into his arms, careful, reverent, holding Ezra like he was something precious. The bond blazed between them, joy and fear and hope and love, all tangled together until Ezra couldn't tell where his emotions ended and Kalen's began. The child, Kalen whispered against his hair. Our child. Ezra buried his face in Kalen's chest and breathed. The pregnancy changed everything. Not between Ezra and Kalen. That bond had only grown stronger, deeper, more certain with each passing day. But the court changed. The whispers shifted. No longer was Ezra just the mysterious Omega who had somehow tamed the supreme Alpha's curse. Now he was carrying the heir to the throne. The temple fell silent. The riots dissolved. The nobles who had called for Ezra's removal suddenly couldn't stop smiling at him in corridors, couldn't stop congratulating Kalen on the blessed news. Hypocrites, all of them. But Ezra found that he didn't care. Let them pretend. Let them scheme. Let them whisper behind their hands. He had Kalen. He had their child growing inside him. He had a future, something he had never dared to imagine, not in 18 years of carrying linens and scrubbing floors and disappearing into the background. The first time he felt the baby move, he was alone in the Western strategy chamber. A flutter, soft and small, like butterfly wings against his insides. Ezra's hand pressed to his stomach. His breath caught. Kalen he sent through the bond, not caring that it was the middle of a council meeting. Come here. The king burst through the doors 30 seconds later, wild-eyed, pheromones spiking with alarm. What's wrong? Are you hurt? Is it? Put your hand here. Ezra guided Kalen's palm to the swell of his belly. For a moment, nothing happened. Kalen's brow furrowed. His mouth opened. Then the baby kicked. Kalen went completely still. His silver eyes widened. His hand pressed more firmly against Ezra's stomach, as if trying to feel it again, to confirm it was real. "That's our child," Ezra said softly. Kalen looked at him with something like awe. And then the Supreme Alpha, the most feared man in the kingdom, the monster whose curse had made kingdoms tremble, lowered his head and pressed a kiss to Ezra's belly. "Hello," he whispered against the swell. "I'm your father." Ezra's eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. Winter had nearly passed by the time the baby came. The snows had begun to melt. Crocus flowers pushed through the frozen ground in the palace gardens. And somewhere in the early hours of the morning, Ezra woke to pain, deep and pulling, spreading through his lower back and abdomen like waves. He didn't need to call for Kalen. The bond carried everything. The king was awake before Ezra could form words, already moving, already shouting for the healers, for Saren, for help. Hours passed. Ezra lost track of time somewhere between the second hour and the fifth. Pain blurred together, punctuated by Kalen's hand gripping his, Kalen's voice in his ear, Kalen's pheromones wrapping around him like a shield. "You're doing so well," the Alpha murmured against his sweat-soaked hair. "Just a little longer. You're so strong, Ezra. So beautiful. I love you. I love you. I love you." Ezra had never heard Kalen say those words before. Not once, in all the months they had been together. He sobbed from pain, from exhaustion, from the overwhelming rightness of hearing it. And then, finally, a cry, sharp and furious, filling the chamber with the unmistakable sound of new life. "It's a boy," Saren announced. She placed the baby on Ezra's chest, red-faced, squalling, tiny fists waving, dark hair plastered to his scalp, silver eyes that blinked open for just a moment, unfocused and new, before squeezing shut again. Ezra's arms closed around him automatically. "Protect," his Omega instincts roared. "Protect, protect, protect." Kalen stared down at them both. His face had gone slack with wonder. His hand, the hand that had killed men, that had shattered stone, that had torn through armies, reached out to touch the baby's cheek with impossible gentleness. "He's perfect," Kalen whispered. Ezra laughed through his tears. "He's covered in blood and screaming. He's perfect." Kalen leaned down and kissed Ezra, soft, lingering, tasting of salt and tears. "Thank you," he said against Ezra's lips. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for—" "Stop talking," Ezra mumbled, exhausted, happy, "and hold your son." Kalen lifted the baby like he was handling spun glass. The little boy squirmed. His face scrunched up. For one terrifying moment, Ezra thought he would start screaming again. Then the baby's silver eyes opened and locked onto Kalen's face and calmed. The same way Ezra calmed the curse. The same inexplicable, impossible resonance that had brought them together in the first place. Kalen's breath caught. "He has your gift," he said softly. Ezra looked at his son, at the tiny hand that had wrapped around Kalen's thumb, at the peaceful expression that had replaced the screaming, at the silver eyes that mirrored his father's. "He has you," Ezra corrected. "That's what matters." Epilogue. 1 year later. The monster the kingdom once feared learned how to rest beside the person he loved most. It wasn't easy. Nothing about their story had ever been easy. There were still challenges, political enemies who whispered in dark corners, remnants of the curse that sometimes stirred when Kalen grew too exhausted, sleepless nights with a teething infant who seemed to have inherited his father's stubbornness. But there was also this. Ezra sat beside the fireplace inside the royal chambers, their son asleep against his chest. The boy Liam, named for the spring flowers that had bloomed the week he was born, had finally stopped fussing, his little face peaceful, his tiny hand curled around Ezra's thumb. Kalen sat on the floor beside them, head resting against Ezra's knee. The Supreme Alpha's eyes were closed. His breathing had gone slow and even. The dark veins of the curse were barely visible now, faint shadows that only appeared when he was truly exhausted, and even then, They faded the moment Ezra touched him. Outside the windows, winter snow fell softly over Blackthorn's citadel. Inside, there was only warmth. Only silence. Only the quiet bond that connected the three of them, Alpha, Omega, Child, into something unbreakable. "I love you," Kalen murmured through the bond, not bothering to open his eyes. Ezra smiled. "I know." He looked down at their son, at the silver eyes that blinked open for just a moment, meeting Ezra's gaze, then Kalen's, before closing again in peaceful sleep. And in that moment, surrounded by everything he had never dared to want, Ezra Vance, now Ezra Morvain, consort of the Northern Kingdom, father of the air, felt nothing but gratitude. For the night he had climbed those stairs. For the Alpha who had fought his own nature to keep him safe. For the child who had come from that impossible, terrifying, beautiful love. And for the monster who had finally found his home. Then,